Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's second lecture for the Initiative on Religion, Pluralism, and American Public Life here at Wake Forest University School of Divinity. My name is Corey Walker. I'm Dean of the School of Divinity and Wake Forest Professor of the Humanities, and I have the honor and pleasure of welcoming a friend of Wake Forest University School of Divinity, an esteemed scholar, but most importantly, a very generous individual. Amy Jill Levine came to Wake Forest School of Divinity as one of the first Margaret A. Steelman lecturers in the School of Divinity. That lectureship was established in 1998, and Amy Jill Levine came in February of 2001 and delivered a lecture entitled Jesus, Gender, and Judaism. This afternoon, we're excited to welcome her back to deliver her lecture, The Present and Possible Future of Jewish-Christian Relations. But before we do that, I want to tell you a bit about this really remarkable scholar. Amy Jill Levine, AJ, is the Rabbi Stanley M. Kessler Distinguished Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies at Hartford International University for Religion and Peace, University Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies Emerita, Mary Jane Wortham Professor of Jewish Studies Emerita, Professor of New Testament Studies Emerita at Vanderbilt University. She's the first Jew to teach New Testament at Rome's Pontifical Biblical Institute. She's an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Her publications include The Misunderstood Jew, The Church and the Scandal of the Jewish Jesus, Short Stories by Jesus, The Enigmatic Parables of a Controversial Rabbi, Jesus for Everyone, Not Just Christians, 6 children's books with Sandy Sasso, The Gospel of Luke, and the Jewish Annotated New Testament, along with a host of other books, co-edited volumes, and articles. In many ways, this series is really modeled after her scholarship and her deep ethic of engaging Christian and Jewish conversations around Judaism, but most importantly, around how we can live a more humane life, develop a more humane society, and most importantly, create a more humane and just world. We're excited for her to join us this evening as she presents the present and possible future of Jewish-Christian relations. Please welcome Professor Amy Jill Levine.
John, I know Terrence got a hug. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Good. Thank you for coming. So gratitude to Dean Walker for that generous introduction. That makes me feel important. To the indefatigable Catherine Morris, who did everything to get me here. You are fabulous, and I want to bring you home with me. To my friend, Pastor Alan Scharouse, who has been a friend for close on 30 years now. And to Terrence for that splendid talk earlier. I was delighted that you mentioned Mickey Schwerner. Mickey Schwerner is my cousin. And one of the earliest memories I have is the family gathering at our house when my Aunt Abby said, "Mickey has gone missing and we don't know where he is." And I remember the adults in the family would not tell me what had happened. And it was only quite later that I found out that he landed in a rock quarry in Mississippi. But that was my family that said, if you see anybody who needs help, you help them. So thank you for keeping his memory for a blessing. Anyway, the theme of this program comes from a statement by German-American Lutheran theologian Paul Tillich. The statement, "The boundary is the best place for acquiring knowledge," which sounds to me like Robert Frost saying good fences make good neighbors. Boundaries can be very helpful. Boundaries can also be really dangerous. The statement fits the title of the program in general, Across the Borders of Tradition, Conversations in Jewish Christian Thought and Theology. I appreciated the invitation to come here, but I'm not a theologian. I am so not a theologian. I'm a Bible scholar. but I'm going to venture into theology. If this doesn't work, please forgive me. The topic is complicated by the initial question of border, since the two traditions, Judaism and Christianity, share a common root rather than a border. That's Second Temple Jewish tradition. Jesus was Jewish, this should not be news, okay? Or Paul, all the Marys. And in the first several centuries, the borders between what eventually becomes called Christianity and what we come to know as Judaism were really fluid. At the time of Paul, one could be both a Jew, even a Pharisee, and at the same time worship Jesus as Lord. Paul himself anticipates in Romans 11 that all Israel, by which he means all Jews, will be saved. Thus, Paul does not consider the Jewish people lost, since for Paul, a Jew and a Pharisee, God remains faithful to the covenants with Israel, that is, the physical descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their wives. Regarding Jesus, other Jews didn't agree. The day that all Jews agree is the day the Messiah comes, or comes back if you prefer. So we didn't agree. The issue on Jesus was not a matter of logic. One did not in the first century, or ideally today, do a cost-benefit analysis to determine if Jesus is Lord. And for my students at Vanderbilt and now at Hartford who would sometimes say, gee, AJ, if you just looked at the Old Testament, to use the Christian Bible Part 1 language, if you just looked at the Old Testament, you would find all those dots connecting Jesus to Genesis and to Isaiah and to the Psalms and so on. This is true. If one puts on Christian lenses, one can find Jesus in every single page of the Old Testament. The problem is if you take the Christian lenses off and you put Jewish lenses on, you'll find a host of other things, but unless you're a Messianic Jew, you won't find Jesus there at all, which means it's not a matter of connecting the dots. Belief in Jesus is not generally a matter of logic, it's a matter of love. Or otherwise put, belief is not a matter of Sudoku, where if you just think, if you have a pencil and an eraser, everybody gets the same answer. Belief is based in revelation. It's not a matter of the heart, the head, it's a matter of the heart. So Jews agreed agreed to disagree over the divinity of Jesus, but at least in the first century, they were all Jews. And then time passed. Following Rome's destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70, a generation after Jesus, and faced with both a generally failed mission to the Jews, an increasing number of Gentiles, by Gentiles I mean not Jewish, not Samaritan, Gentiles, joining the assemblies gathered in Jesus' name, the writers of our Christian texts, the Gospels, 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century documents, had to address the failure of the Jewish mission. The Gospels begin this division, epitomized by the Gospel of Matthew's insistence in chapter 27, verse 25, that all the people cried out for Jesus' death, his blood be on us and on our children, and by the Gospel of John's negative depictions of Jews as children of the devil. Children of the devil is not a compliment. I have to point that out to people because the devil's having like a reawakening these days. Borders began to be established between the followers of Jesus and anyone else, both Jewish and pagan, who disagreed. And soon thereafter, borders were also established between those who claimed sufficient authority or power and all other followers, with accusations of heresy, with excommunications, and eventually with executions over matters of theology. Because when religion gets into the border difference, people die. Christians in the next few centuries increased their anti-Jewish polemic. The effect was both to bolster Christian identity by finding a convenient scapegoat and to claim as their own legacy the legacy of the Jews, including the Hebrew scriptures, which were first called by the North African church father Tertullian the Old Testament. They were helped here, the Christian ideal of claiming Jewish identity, claiming Jewish legacy, by pagan Rome, which after the Second Judean revolt against Rome in 132 to 135, renamed the city of Jerusalem Aelia Capitolina and renamed the state of Judea Syria Palestina. The removal of the name Judea sought to remove Jewish indigeneity in the land. Following Constantine's he made the empire Christian. Of the empire in the early 4th century, the state church began to strip away from Jews as well as from pagans the rights that Christians now held. These efforts continued in the blood-saturated history of the past 2 millennia, with which Jews are all too familiar, but as I found, of which non-Jews don't even know this history. Blood libels, crusades, expulsions, restrictions on land ownership, trade, employment, clothing that marked Jews as Jews. The original ghetto was founded in Venice to keep Jews away from Gentile citizens, pogroms. In other words, the church began to set up borders. Today, fewer and fewer people know about the Nazi atrocities against Jews, let alone against queer people, the Roma and the Sinti, otherwise known as Gypsies, people with disabilities, Polish Catholic academics, Jehovah's Witnesses, and so on. More and more people today, for reasons that are opaque to me, find that saluting like Nazis or holding their views is a cool thing to do. I don't get it. Programs here, such as that you're holding at Wake Forest, may help prevent continuing ignorance and bigotry and the violence that comes from both. So thank you for doing what you do. 60 years ago, in October 1965, the participants in what was known as Vatican II published a document called Nostra Aetate, Latin for In Our Time. This conciliar document, which was debated and it did not pass unanimously, insisted that, quote, Jews should not be presented as rejected or accursed by God. The church, mindful of the patrimony she shares with the Jews, and moved not by political reasons, but by the gospel's spiritual love, decries hatred, persecutions, displays of anti-Semitism directed against Jews at any time and by anyone. This was terrific, but it was not prompted by biblical studies. I'm a biblicist. I want the Bible to be behind everything good. This was not the case. What prompted Nostra Aetate was a combination of the Shoah, the Holocaust, personal friendships, which is why friendships in that meeting one-on-one that we heard about earlier today are so important, and the morality of Pope St. John the 23rd. As with slavery and with sexism and with anti-Semitism, what the Bible endorses is not always what the church needs to promote, because the church or in the synagogue are more than their sacred scriptures. Next, biblical interpretation and theological studies are not just intellectual exercises. Today, given the global increase of anti-Semitism accompanied by Christian nationalism, questions of borders, who gets to define them, matter all the more. Today, given not only the increase of anti-Christian activity by ultra-nationalist Jews, but also the expansionist policies of members of the Israeli government and some of their Christian Zionist allies, questions of borders and who gets to define them matter all the more. Today, given the increasing lack of knowledge of the Shoah, people who deny that it happened, and people in parts of the world who were not directly affected by it, and who may see it, if they see it at all, as just one of many genocides, what we do in Jewish-Christian relations matters all the more. In conversations with each other, biblical scholars and theologians, Jews and Christians, can improve our understandings of text and theology, and we can also move closer to enacting the central moral teachings of both of our traditions. Since both Judaism and Christianity are unfinished, the first awaits the Messiah, the second awaits the Messiah's return, we can work together, and when the Messiah comes, she will surprise everyone, and then we'll stop arguing. This look to the future, when we finally complete the task and see clearly rather than through a mirror dimly, also entails looking at the past. So I want to put in a plea for including within the borders of what we do in academy, church, and synagogue a concern for history. Today, in our mostly presentist society, where what matters is what happens today, and where history is increasingly seen as irrelevant or retold with alternative facts, religious education must retain in its historical knowledge. In my last years at Vanderbilt Divinity School, I retired in August of 2021, I encountered students who insisted that history is irrelevant since the only important reading is what matters today, and particularly what mattered to them. A few asserted that history is a white supremacist enterprise and therefore should be canceled. Others said that history promoted elitism since it required knowledge of other languages and historical contexts, and still others insisted that only some forms of history matter. I think this is not helpful. If we give up history, we wind up sounding like the notorious anti-Semite Henry Ford, who proclaimed history is bunk. So I responded to these students, I smiled at them, and I put on my pastoral hat, and I suggested that it's through history that we recover the stories of marginalized and especially enslaved people, as Catherine Shaner has done so brilliantly. We recover the history of women and queer people, people with disabilities, people who are impoverished, and so on. To read the Bible only for our own time is to strip mine it for what we find usable and to deny the identities of the people who produced the texts and even died for them. Such ahistorical moves, in effect, serve to colonize the text. While reading the Bible in its original languages and knowing something about their context does require specialized knowledge, this knowledge is increasingly freely available on the internet. What we really need is better internet access for the globe. More, to understand everything through our own vernacular is again a form of colonizing. The students were not happy, and I thought retirement looked better and better. One can, in fact, deconstruct the master's house with the master's tools. I see no reason to cede the past to those who would colonize it for one ideological agenda or another, just as I see no reason to cede the Bible to people who read it only through one narrow religious, political, or nationalistic lens. In constructing borders, we need to figure out who we want to keep in, who has been kept out, and where those borders should be. Lack of historical knowledge not only undermines preaching and teaching, it also undermines theology. While some forms of what are called constructive Christian theology or liberation theology ignore the Bible or at best strip verses out of context, it seems to me that the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible, and the Old and New Testaments, the Christian Bible, understood traditionally as sources of revelation by Jews and Christians, should always be in dialogue with theology, because if theology doesn't have an anchor, then it's free to be whatever it wants to be, but it loses a sense of community. Indeed, while Christian contextual theologies, with their investment in how marginalized communities experience Christ today, as one who sides with the poor and oppressed, as a figure of resistance against structures of domination, are valuable both academically and practically, to this concern should also be added a warning. Some contextual theologies detached from biblical history and from encounters with Jews repeat anti-Semitic tropes. Jesus, the liberator, comes to liberate people not only to authenticity, hope, freedom, even maybe liberalism. He also comes to liberate from contemporary social systems that get mapped onto Judaism. Dualism remains in place as long as the last are first and the first are last. I want the last to have a taste of what it means to be first, but I don't want that system of last and first fully instantiated always. Such discussions need to distinguish borders. For contextual theologies and interfaith dialogue in general, I have at least 4. I have more, but I have to stop at some point. First, I would like the border of avoiding making Jesus look good by making Judaism look bad. As I have argued elsewhere, in particular regarding past publications of the World Council of Churches, anti-Semitic comments made by minoritized individuals should not be published under the rubric of either they didn't know any better, which is paternalism, or they have been previously silenced, which is no excuse for anti-Semitism. Gatekeepers, printers, publishers, copy editors, etc., should keep anti-Semitism out like they should keep racism out and sexism and so on. My point here is not to censor. It is to be more sensitive to the people who are being discussed, and ideally to discuss with such people rather than just talk about them. Second, we should not sacrifice the particulars of our own tradition on the altar of interfaith sensitivity, which means we should recognize borders between religion. The point of dialogue is not to find a lowest common denominator religion, which is just boring, among other things. It's also unfaithful to both traditions. It is to hear views that are different, even incompatible with our own, and then engage in understanding. Dialogue without disagreement is not dialogue. If the Christian wants to claim salvation only through the Christ, well, you should do so, because that's what the text says. The Jew can feel free to disagree. And by the way, if you want to know how Jews can get saved even if Jesus is the gatekeeper, I can answer that one too, but that's not history. That one I made up. We can come back to that later. Third, dialogue is a place to discuss what might be considered transgressions of borders, where we think somebody has crossed the line. For example, I find it at best misguided for Christians to hold a Passover Seder on Holy Thursday. The Seder, a product primarily of late antiquity and following, and quite likely developed to counter Christian claims, I think it's partly anti-Christian, is not what Jesus celebrated. He would have had a lamb sacrificed in the Jerusalem temple, and he would have eaten this lamb with family and friends in the city of Jerusalem. He would not have then had ham on Easter Sunday, right? Plus, you can't get it in the galley. He would not have had matzah ball soup, used a Haggadah, the script for the Passover Seder, sung the song Dayenu, or had a Seder plate. Plus, according to the Gospel of John, the Last Supper is not a Passover meal. To the contrary, Jesus replaces the Passover lambs. If Christians seek to celebrate the Exodus from Egypt, which is worth celebrating, as we heard in the earlier election, they might look to resources in their own tradition, perhaps starting with the Black Church. And fourth, while dialogue should not be used in order to convert the other, because that's not dialogue either, that's proselytizing, neither should participants set up borders that restrain themselves from expressing their particular views. So dialogue which requires silencing of commitments is also not dialogue. In dialogue, we Jews and Christians have advanced our discussion of how we understand the God of Israel and how we interpret scriptures that we share from Genesis to Isaiah to the Psalms. We now also better recognize the limitations of our memories, of the parts of our history that we emphasize, and the parts that we've either forgotten or repressed. For example, although not very well known among Jews, the Jewish tradition does have a concept of the suffering Messiah. Who knew? I did. In the Babylonian Talmud, I'm in Tractate Sanhedrin 98b, the rabbis name as the Messiah the one with leprosy of the house of Rabbi Yudah Hanasi, as it is stated, and then they throw in a biblical quote. Indeed, our illnesses he did bear, and our pains he endured, yet we did esteem him injured, stricken by God, and afflicted. If you're a Christian, that should sound familiar. But that's Isaiah 53, the same suffering servant song that permeates New Testament references to Jesus. We Jews also have a medieval tradition of the Messiah, son of Ephraim, who, according to the text Besikta Rabbati, suffers and dies on behalf of the Jewish people. How do I know this? Because I got interested in Jesus and then went looking in the Jewish tradition to find out what else we had. Interfaith dialogue can make us better members of our own tradition by doing this comparison. At the same time, Christians may come to appreciate how the Jewish tradition has variously identified Isaiah's suffering servant. There are about 20 separate nominations, whether the prophet himself, Isaiah, or the Jewish community in general, so the medieval commentator Rashi, or Moses, or some of the others. The view of Jesus as the suffering servant should not limit the servant's identity to Jesus. Finding Jesus in the pages of the Old Testament does not exhaust the meaning of those pages. It's not like Jesus fulfilled something so you can take a razor blade and cut out the verse and say, been there, done that, and put it up on the shelf. That verse has more meaning than just Jesus. So today, ideally, Jews and Christians both can see the suffering servant embodied by anyone whose suffering calls people to account and helps them recognize social sin. Terence called the names of at least two of these people in his talk. In dialogue, we can address what we expect of a Messiah and how we know one when we see one. For example, the medieval Jewish philosopher Maimonides denied that Jesus can be the Messiah, since the Messiah will, among other things, gather Jews in the diaspora back to the land of Israel and be recognized by the entire world. Side note, if all the Jews have to go to the land of Israel in order for the Messiah to come, I am personally holding up the show. Why? Because my husband is allergic to sesame products. And with all the tahina and hummus and halava in the land of Israel, I can't move. This makes him, of course, an anti-Sesamite. Back to Maimonides. So while Maimonides did not think that Jesus was the Messiah, he also acknowledged that Christianity brought the God of Israel and the scriptures of Israel to the nations, and therefore that Christianity is part of the divine plan, which I think is remarkably generous for a medieval rabbi. The result was the conclusion that for Jews, accepting Jesus as Lord would constitute heresy, incorrect worship. But for non-Jews, for Gentiles, for the nations, Christianity was neither idolatrous nor blasphemous. And we can get there when we start to know each other. Maimonides knew enough Christians to know what they were saying. Such matters are necessary for discussions today of how both Jews and Christian communities are to understand Messianic Jews, Jewish worshipers of Jesus, who want to maintain Jewish identity and practices. For Jews, traditionally, Messianic Jews engage in heresy. For Christians, traditionally, they are reinforcing that dividing wall, speaking of borders, that Ephesians chapter 2 claims was destroyed by the cross. But both traditional views are now up for discussions in certain circles of Jewish-Christian dialogue. Complicating that task, many members of Messianic Jewish groups are not Jewish in the legal sense, the halakhic sense. That is, they are not children of Jewish mothers. So where do we set the borders? Who's in, who's out, and who gets to determine who's in and who's out? Churches will do the same thing, for some churches at least, in terms of who can participate in the communion meal or the Eucharistic service. Were you baptized in this church? Were you baptized by dunking or by full immersion? And so on. Next, Jews and Christians in conversation have come to realize that we begin with substantially different anthropologies. Christology, the idea of who Jesus is, imparts the view that humanity experienced a fall from grace in Eden when Adam caused sin to enter the world. This break in the human-divine relationship required the reconciliation accomplished through the cross. So the church has what might be called original sin. That should sound vaguely familiar. The traditional Jewish view of the story of the Garden of Eden is what we might call an original opportunity. An opportunity conveyed both by the beginnings of repentance by and forgiveness of Adam and Eve, and the ongoing relationship of God and humanity outside of Eden. So borders can help us see where we agree to disagree. We Jews and Christians realize that we sometimes have different ethical commitments, with divorce and abortion, gender and sexuality among the best exemplars. Both theologians and biblical scholars, Jews and Christians, would do well to discuss such matters together, especially today, given attempts to promulgate legislation based on limited knowledge of biblical and theological claims. And I note here that on such topics, there are also disagreements within as well as across borders. Here's a place where I wish some biblical scholars were talking to some people in government. Regarding biblical studies, some walls have come down. For example, replacing the earlier erroneous views that saw Jesus as abandoning Judaism, today we see him fully participating in it. Instead of seeing Jesus as eliminating Torah, biblical law, Mosaic law, we see him making it stricter. To the commandment against murder, he adds a commandment against anger. To the commandment against adultery, he adds the commandment against lust. As for the famous contrast between an eye for an eye and Jesus' insistence on turning the other cheek, we realize first that Jesus has changed the subject. There is a huge difference between getting whacked across your right cheek, right? So this is my right hand. If I hit you on your right cheek, figure out where your right cheek is. It has to be a backhanded slap. It's not a slap meant to do harm, it's a slap of dismissal. There's a huge difference between getting a backhanded slap and losing a limb. And the other thing that we realize is that the Jewish tradition through the rabbinic lens and Jesus addresses this situation through a different focus. Jesus focuses on the victim's response. Do not punch back, do not retaliate, do not meet violence with violence. When we go to rabbinic literature on the tally on this eye for an eye, the rabbis say, first of all, you can't carry it out literally because no two eyes are alike. I have terrible vision, and God help me, I had cataract surgery 2 weeks ago, and I can't see a thing because I need new prescriptions. Pray for me. If you have 20/20 vision and I take out your eye and then you want to take out mine, I guarantee you that you will have lost more than I have lost. And as one rabbi put it, if I put out your eye but I'm blind, what difference does it make? So what the rabbis say is let's focus on the perpetrator. Anybody who takes out a person's eye has to pay for pain, medical expenses, loss of work due to injury, humiliation, and so on. The rabbis focus on the perpetrator. Here's where we put Jesus focusing on the victim and the rabbis focusing on the perpetrator in conversation. The points are not mutually exclusive, they are rather complementary, and if we put them together, then the work of justice can be done. Instead of seeing Jesus rejecting laws of ritual purity by touching a man suffering from a skin disease or a bleeding lady or a corpse, today we recognize that there is no prohibition against such context. We also recognize that rather than reject purity laws, Jesus restores people to states of ritual purity. Today we realize that in speaking to women or healing their bodies, Jesus is fully within his Jewish orbit. He does not invent feminism. Indeed, today we historians can use the New Testament as a source for reconstructing the lives of Jewish women. For example, the Gospels and Acts tell us that Jewish women in Judea and Galilee owned their own homes, had access to their own money, served in patronage capacities, appeared in public, had freedom of travel, and so were not restricted to women's quarters. They attended synagogues, they participated in worship and sacrifice in the Jerusalem temple, and they were even leaders in ancient diaspora synagogues, a point together with their patronage that underlies the role of Phoebe the deacon in Romans 1. Here, Jewish-Christian dialogue together can contribute to discussions of women's authority in churches today that would deny women such roles. Today we have a better understanding of who the Pharisees were, and we don't have to look at them as the negative exemplars in order to make Jesus look good. Today we take more seriously the fact that Paul, the only Pharisee from whom we have written texts, sees himself as the apostle to the Gentiles, and so we realize that his comments about the law are for Gentiles and not for Jews. Today we know a whole lot of stuff that we didn't know 60 years ago. But this stuff is important, just as important as it was 60 years ago, maybe even more so today. Indeed, this work matters to me personally. I would not have spent my life studying Jesus in the New Testament if I did not think that he had worthwhile things to say. More, I find in this study that I become a better Jew. I become a better Jew historically, since study of the New Testament recovers for me parts of my own history, especially a first-century Jewish practice and belief that my synagogue did not preserve. My synagogue, in effect, put a border around the first century. Crossing over those borders and moving into the New Testament allowed the doors to be open. I also become a better Jew theologically, since in conversation with Christian theologians, I am often prompted, as I've mentioned, to think about questions in my own tradition that my own tradition does not foreground, whether of heaven and hell or incarnation, or even the function of sin. I fully appreciate what the Lutheran theologian Christopher Stendhal called holy envy, the recognition of something wonderful in a tradition that is not my own. Dialogue does not mean erasing differences, but it can mean appreciating those differences even more. And it is with this appreciation for the New Testament, and even more for my friends who both hold this text sacred and seek more positive Jewish-Christian relations, that I turn to one more issue necessary for dialogue, the combined topics of supersessionism and anti-Semitism. And here's where ethics and theological boundaries are needed to keep anti-Semitism out, while certain New Testament texts would admit it. The interest in insisting that the New Testament is not supersessionist. By supersessionism, I mean the New Testament takes over all the promises to Israel and they go simply to the members of the church. It's a relatively recent concern. For centuries, what was also known as replacement theology, the idea that God took away the covenants made with the Jewish people because of their disobedience that culminated in the killing of Jesus, and gave those covenants to the Gentile church, went unquestioned. For Christians, the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, the loss of Jewish national autonomy, and the Christianization of the empire under Constantine proved to them that Christianity was right and that Judaism was wrong. In this zero-sum game of religious competition, there could be no competing truth claims. There was right and there was wrong, and there was no dialogue. We talk about supersessionism today because of the Shoah and because of Nostra Aetate. Historically, supersessionist views led to the death of Jews. Theologically, they suggest that God is not faithful to covenantal promises, so supersessionism is a problem because it leads to not good things. Consequently, Christians have thought to diffuse the New Testament of supersessionist or anti-Semitic implications. The problem is, it doesn't work. For example, concerning depictions of Jews in the fourth gospel, exegetes, biblical scholars, have claimed that John is only referring to some Jews, such as Jewish leaders or Jewish authority. But that's not what the 70 or so uses of the Greek term judaioi suggest. The Gospels were not originally read because most people couldn't read. That comes with the rise of public education. Public education, what a concept. A good thing. So most people were illiterate. They had the text read to them. It was like going to a movie, right? But if you have the word Judaios used 70 or 71 times, Marcus doesn't look at Julia at use 4 and say, gee, Julia, do you think he's talking about all Jews now or just the Jewish leaders? That's not how people listen to a text. Nor are terms like Jewish leaders or Jewish authorities helpful, since it's really a definition of how they lead or what they lead or whom they lead or who appointed them in the first place. Further, since in John references to Pharisees or to priests morph into the Jews, the restricted interpretation doesn't work. Or some Christian scholars suggest that the gospel invective against Jews or Pharisees is in-house rhetoric. It's simply a record of one group of Jews speaking with another, a version of prophetic denunciation found in Amos or Jeremiah, or a rhetoric comparable to what we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But I don't think these arguments work either. While Jesus was a Jew speaking to other Jews, the words he spoke are repackaged into gospels that are then read by non-Jews. Nor do we know with certainty either who wrote the gospels or to which audiences, Jewish, Gentile, or both, they were addressed. Thus, these words are not comparable to Israel's prophets, whose words were preserved by the Jews, and nor are they comparable to the rhetoric of the Dead Sea Scrolls, because the scrolls were not used for evangelistic purposes. To suggest that the gospel polemic is simply intra-Jewish dialogue winds up blaming the Jews for the invective, and then everybody can feel good about it and move on. Some scholars offer the translation Judean for the New Testament Greek term Judaios, and it's a legitimate translation. In this case, it's not the Jews who killed Jesus, but the Judeans. Well, it's a difference without much difference, because everybody in the church hears the Jews as well. Moreover, if we take every single use of Judaios in the New Testament and translate it as Judean, then we have no Jews in the New Testament. I need the German here for effect. We have a Judenrein New Testament. We have a New Testament purified of Jews. And if there are no Jews in the New Testament, then I can't talk about Jesus the Jew or Mary the Jew or Paul the Jew. So that doesn't help. So what do? Here's what I think is going on. I think the New Testament is supersessionist, and parts of it may also be anti-Semitic. I would rather acknowledge and address these problems rather than deny them. I also, by the way, see parts of the shared scripture as anti-Canaanite, sexist, and otherwise problematic. I don't think we need to excuse the Bible. I think we need to wrestle with it. So here we are. I think the New Testament is supersessionist, but it can be supersessionist in a nice way. Supersessionism need not be nasty. Paul is supersessionist, but in Romans, if not in 1 Thessalonians, with its comments about how the Jews killed the Lord Jesus, or 2 Corinthians with its comments about how we Jews read our own scriptures with a veil over our eyes, at least in Romans, he's nice about it. Paul affirms that the covenant with Israel, that is with the Jews, has never been revoked. It's never been abrogated. That's great. Love it. Because if he thought that the Jews got in apart from the cross, then Jesus really dies to no purpose, or his death is not universal. So leave the problem in there and then address it. And again, do not sacrifice the particulars of one's own tradition on the altar of interfaith sensitivity. Paul insists that the covenant with the Jews, katasarka to use the Greek, according to the flesh, remains. He is concerned, and appropriately so, about his fellow Jews, friends, and relatives. And this concern Paul raises for us, and for this concern, Paul raises for us today another theological problem. What is the Christian theologian to do with Paul, who happens to be ethnocentric? According to Paul, God gave the Jews, I'm in Romans 9 here, the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the Torah, the temple service, and the promises. To them belong the patriarchs, and from them, according to the flesh, comes the Christ who is over all. This is ethnocentrism. And today, ethnocentrism, with a few notable exceptions, is considered by many to be a sin. On the other hand, for some people in a minoritized situation, ethnocentrism keeps the community intact. Ethnocentrism may be a matter of survival. On the other hand, what worked in the first century may not work today. So this is stuff we need to discuss. Matters of ethnicity also concern Christology. For example, should the human Jesus also be seen as a universal figure? Should he be portrayed as Costa Rican or Filipino or Aleut or Swedish? Or should he look like a Jew, whatever that means? Scarlett Johansson, Goldie Hawn, Adam Sandler. Should he be dressed in a tallit and tefillin, or perhaps in a keffiyeh, or both, or neither? Where are the borders? Should there be borders? I suspect that for any movement based on faith or ideology, supersessionism is inevitable. Universalizing religions or ideologies are exclusive. Each movement proposes that it has improved on the anterior or rival tradition, and most argue if they are right, the rival groups must be wrong or at least in second place or lacking. The rival groups are thus at best pitied or consigned to an eventual change of mind or dismissed or anathematized. The borders go up, outsiders are at best second-rate or limited, or they're damned. Minoritized groups, as were the initial followers of Jesus in both pagan and Jewish context, likely found supersessionist views helpful in the process of self-definition. Supersessionism helped them maintain their identity despite majority rejection or critique. Like strategic essentialism, which is used in some studies of race and gender to minimize difference and to celebrate what unites a group, supersessionism can have salutary results when applied in limited context. So, if supersessionism and universalizing religions is inevitable, our task is to determine how best to address it in the interests of peace. We also need to determine if what worked in the first century no longer works in the 21st, when the minority is now the majority, and when the powerless now hold the power. Side note, supersessionism is less a problem for Jews because Jews never settled down just to be a religion. Jews always kept an ethnic component. So if you're an ethnic group, you don't have to say this group is somehow universally better than another group. You're just different. It's easier that way. For the Gospels and other places in the New Testament, such as the Epistle to the Hebrews, side note, I keep having to explain to my students that Jews don't read the Epistle to the Hebrews because it's in the New Testament. Supersessionism enters when one group claims to be the only heir of a shared history or tradition. The Gospels of Matthew and John, for another example, love Jewish concerns. They love the Torah, they love what became the Tanakh, the scriptures of Israel. They love Jewish history, they love Abraham and Moses and David, they love the festivals like Passover and the Sabbath. They even like the temple. But these same Gospels see Jews as damned without acknowledgement of the Christ. It's one thing to love all things Jewish, it's something else to extend that to love Jews. The Gospels strip the Jews of their ancestry, because for both Matthew and John, the true children of Abraham are the people who follow Jesus. Matthew chapter 3 depicts John the immerser announcing, God is able from these stones to raise up children to Abraham. Ironically, by the way, this determination of identity based on what one does rather than one's lineage is consistent with Pharisaic thought as opposed to priestly thought. Pharisaic identity is determined by choice, by action. Priestly identity is immutable, determined by birth. In John chapter 8, Jesus tells the Jews, Judaioi, who insist Abraham is our father, that if you are Abraham's children, you would do what Abraham did. But now you're trying to kill me. That's not what Abraham did. For John, ethnicity is irrelevant, since one must be, according to John, born anew or born from above, or if you must, born again. Geography in the sense of sacred space is also irrelevant for John, because as John 4 puts it, the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshiper will worship the Father in spirit and truth. Ephesians chapter 2 speaks of how the Christ was abolishing the law with its commandments and ordinances, that he might create in himself one new humanity in place of two, thus making peace. That's getting rid of borders, but in the process denying Jews our own identity. It seems to me that Matthew and John are embracing the idea of a new humanity, or what Clement of Alexandria would eventually call a new race, a people that are neither Jews nor of the nations, the ethne, but something else detached from parents, ancestry, homeland, and all other distinctive markers. Something similar is happening in 1 Peter 2, where it is the followers of Jesus who are, quote, a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people. Who's in and who's out? Questions of supersessionism become acute when discussions turn to the land of Israel, and I don't see how today we cannot discuss this. Christian theologians will need to determine if they should therefore support Zionism, the view that many Jews have that Israel is the national Jewish homeland, or is particularity to be superseded by universalism. And on this matter, we need to consider a major difference between Jews and Christians, which I've already hinted at. With a Jewish philosopher named Moses Mendelssohn, this is Felix's grandfather, by the way. Felix came up in earlier conversation, the composer. This is the granddad. With Moses Mendelssohn in the 18th century, the idea of Jews as a religion, a faith community, developed. But Jews never ceased to be, whether in our own self-definition or in how non-Jews understood us, to be an ethnos, a people, with the attendant sense of a common ancestry from the patriarchs and matriarchs and a common homeland. More, to think of Jews only as a faith community, that is, a group held together by doctrine, prevents recognizing the diversity of Jewish opinions on the Middle East or on most issues. Jews as a people, a nation, or an ethnic group hold diverse views, just as do the citizens of the United States, who may possibly find themselves in disagreement with their government. Right. Finally, to recognize that Jews are an ethnos and ethnic groups helps us see that Zionism is not necessarily a theological category, it is also an historical category, since people find a connection to their ethnic homeland, the Irish to Ireland, the Kenyans to Kenya, the Mexicans to Mexico, and so on. The same point should, of course, be made for the Palestinian people who see the land of Palestine as their national homeland. So where do we draw the borders? On the map, in theology, in biblical interpretation? Who gets to draw them? And who has the responsibility for maintaining peace on either side? These could not be more important issues. So we have dialogue. And when we have dialogue, as we have here, we have the possibilities of better mutual understanding. We can better determine what borders are needed to keep out the dangers and enhance internal security and flourishing, and what walls need to be pulled down to accommodate peace and reconciliation. These are difficult questions, but they are essential questions. Wake Forest set up the topic of borders. Nothing could be more important. Wake Forest Divinity School set up the idea of Jewish-Christian dialogue to allow us to have these discussions. Thank you to Wake Forest for your vision, and thank you for the invitation.
Let's thank A.J. Levine for that wonderful, wonderful lecture. We do have some cards for your questions, so if you want to write your questions down. Our newest member of the Wake Forest University School of Divinity Community, our dear colleague Dan. Dan is here. Dan's our Director of Communications, Marketing, and Public Relations. Dan can collect those and we can raise questions and continue the conversation for a little while longer. AJ, I not only have all these typed notes, but I also have notes from your talk. I wrote them down. And one thing that really struck me by your talk, not only the challenges, the ways in which you explicated the challenges of borders epistemologically, experientially, and most importantly, ethically. You did this as one who's deeply attentive to the ways in which, as a biblicist, the ways in which Scripture shapes and informs our communities. In a moment where the boundaries are high, and the borders are high, and they're being reinforced. As a biblicist, how do we turn to this text where most individuals just want to reject it or say, that time is done, it's over?
Biblical literacy is probably at an all-time high. People have their select verses, but they don't bother to read the rest, so they know their go-to verses for gender, sexuality, or politics, or whatever. I want to reclaim it as part of the public sphere, and I want to reclaim it in a way that's not goofy, and that's not dumbed down, and it's not so parochial that only certain people will get it. So how can we do this? We have options. Social media is, granted it's saturated, but why should people I disagree with get to control it? We have letters to editors. We have town hall meetings where sometimes people say things which are helpful and they get reported. We also have, at least for people in churches, and I think people in churches are overlooked, as so many churches today in church growth, let's get more members, let's get more members, they forget about the people who are already in the pew. Let's talk to them and hear what they're thinking about Bible and give them a little bit more authority to be able to interpret with the clergy rather than just have the clergy do it for them. Programs such as yours that open up divinity programs to people who are retired, to people who can only come at certain times, who have to take evening classes and so on, that's really helpful also. So is everybody going to be reading the Bible? Well, probably in Oklahoma. To provide better lessons thereof, right?
Of course, we're here in the South, and in the South, we always have to, one way or another, invoke Faulkner. Faulkner's famous little quote, "The past is not dead, it is not even past." How do we deal with the ways in which the politics of the past are being mobilized in our moment?
I think that might have been the shortest sentence Faulkner ever wrote. If we don't know our history, then we're back to the Santayana problem. It's either going to repeat or it's going to rhyme, right? Better education would be helpful. Better church education would be helpful. That's what I've been writing adult Bible study guides, because I think that's helpful. Putting stuff on tape is helpful because people don't want to read anymore. God help them. So we've got a copy over here of Jesus for Everyone, Not Just Christians. And I have this line in there, which is kind of a toss-off line. I live in Nashville, which is kind of like living here. So the music may be better. You have better basketball. Anyway, so I said, and we have these bumper stickers that says, "The Bible says it, I believe it." And what I wanted instead is a bumper sticker that says, "The Bible says it, let's discuss." So a group of Episcopal clergy in St. Louis actually gave me a bunch of bumper stickers. I've been passing them out to people. Even just what you put on your car can make all the difference in the world.
You ended your talk, your lecture, reminding us that there's a real big issue in this room, on this campus, in this nation, and in our world. And that is the events of October 7th, as well as the resulting war in Gaza. But we also have this text, these texts that give us meaning, that folks hold sacred. Is there something in that text that we can use to help us understand and comprehend the dynamics of this moment?
Yeah, there's a huge amount in there. Three quick things. As I mentioned, the term Palestine was used at the time. It's already as early as Herodotus. But the general use of the term Palestine really comes in after 132 to 135. And I don't want Jewish history to be erased. So it's a both and rather than an either or. In Leviticus, we have love your neighbor as yourself, which really does mean fellow Jew, Leviticus 19:18. But if you go a little bit farther in that same chapter, Leviticus 19:34 is you have to love the not native, the ger, the stranger, the alien, but it really means the migrant. You have to love the person who's not native born. Why? Because you were not native born in the land of Egypt, and you knew what it was like to be someplace where you were minoritized, and that went bad really very, very quickly. Slavery followed by genocide. You know what it's like. Claim that. And third, for me, I find personally really helpful, it's sometimes called the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is a terrible term because it presumes that there's only one, right? And all the rest of the Samaritans are pretty awful. It's like it's the parable of the Good Baptist. I mean, it just doesn't sound right. What we can do is we can move that parable into contemporary discourse. Many Americans, I find, we don't have a sense of geography, right? When people say from the river to the sea, they're not sure what river and sea they're talking about. So ancient Samaria is today what's normally called the West Bank, areas A and C, or the future Palestinian state. Right? So if we do the parable of the man who fell among the robbers, which is how it was originally called by people in the early church, I want to see that in contemporary terms. So the guy's in the ditch, two people who should have stopped to help walk by, a priest and a Levite. And the person who stops is a Samaritan. So what's going on here? Why a priest and a Levite? Why not Mary and Martha, or James and John? Or anybody else you want to put in? Well, because Jews divide into three general categories. You're either a priest, which means you're a descendant of Aaron, Moses' brother, or you're a Levite, which means you're a descendant of Aaron's ancestor, Levi, who's Jacob's son number 3, and everybody else is a descendant from the other children of Jacob, the 12 tribes of Israel. If you're a Jew by choice, you come in under the other descendants of Jacob. So if you say priest, Levite, everybody knows the third one's going to be an Israelite. You know that. And what you get instead is priest, Levite, Samaritan. Samaritans were not the oppressed minority. They were the enemy. The first century historian Josephus talks about Samaritans attacking Jewish pilgrims going from Galilee in the north to Jerusalem in the south, which is where the temple is. I mean, it was just really bad. But it turns out the Samaritan, who would be looked at as the enemy, the one who's going to kill you, is the one who actually saves you. So I just want to do the geography. I'm an Israeli Jew going down the Jerusalem to Jericho road. It's about a 600-foot drop-off. You need a 4-wheel drive to do it well. And I'm attacked by bandits, and I'm stripped and I'm beaten, and I'm half dead and I'm lying in a ditch. And two people who should have stopped to help failed to do so. The first, an Israeli medic from the Jewish Defense Force. And the second, a member of Quaker Witness for Peace. And the person who stops to help is a Palestinian member of Hamas, an organization dedicated to Israel's destruction. But if we could just picture that the person we think is going to blow us up is actually the one person who might save us, then we may be getting somewhere, because what Jesus helps us do is imagine something that's not part of our worldview until we start thinking about it. By the way, if Jesus were a Samaritan, this would be called the parable of the good Jew, which is equally offensive, but it would be a Palestinian in a ditch and a member of the Israeli Defense Force who stops to help. Do the modern, try to reimagine, because if we can even just think about it, then we may be able to get there. If we can't think about it, if we can't even imagine it, I don't think we have any hope.
Well, we have a question that's trying to figure out how we should think. And, any of these conversations with an audience like this, you'll find you'll have some very interesting questions come up. This one is interesting in the sense that it's asking about the very nature, the methods of Jewish-Christian dialogue, and is asking you to explain what's the role of broadly historical critical methods in Jewish-Christian dialogue. We have a lot of the history, but oftentimes we don't have a lot of the critical, the self-reflexive.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And a lot of dialogue is not based on the historical critical method at all, because a lot of the dialogue is based on theology, or it's a matter of show and tell, so it's not really dialogue. It's this is what I have, and this is what I have, and oh, isn't that interesting? Without that second step is, well, why do you believe that, and what are the implications of that, or can you see this text in this way rather than that way? That's why it's helpful to have a text as opposed to an abstract concept. People come into dialogue for different reasons. The dominant reason Jews come into dialogue is to prevent anti-Semitism. And a lot of Christians have come in for precisely that same reason. But what happens is that and Christians don't want to be anti-Semitic. But once we get past that, then we can start learning a lot more about ourselves. And here's where some of that historical critical work comes in. It can get in the way because dialogue is very often done by people who are not professionals, so how do you know what the good history is? And that becomes a matter of, not everything on the internet is worth reading, neither is everything in the library. So one needs to be careful about this, and looking at different perspectives tends to be fairly helpful. Of course, you could just read everything that I've written and you can trust it.
Well, this question sort of dovetails on that. In addition to everything, read everything that AJ has written. who are some of the other figures we should be reading, not only in these types of settings, but how do we have a broader conversation around these topics? Do you have some ideas for us or some suggestions?
Yeah, so when I knew I was doing this, I looked up Terence's book with Jack Berlinerblau, and I thought that was great. So, people you invite. There we go. For me in biblical studies, there are certain people I will read everything that they write. I really like Bart Ehrman. He can be annoying at times and he can be snarky, but he's always interesting. And he makes me think, and I find that really, really helpful. Paula Fredrickson, Adele Reinhardt, Dale Allison. I just heard him do a podcast at Princeton just this past week. It was brilliant. I'm finding very interesting the work of a fellow named Willie Jennings, who's doing stuff on racism and anti-Semitism. I'm not sure I agree with him, but it's like reading Richard Hayes. He really makes me think. Matthew Thiessen, Canadian scholar, Mennonite, done some fabulous work on historical Jesus material. I read voraciously. I read catalogs. I read like a blog post and listservs where people say, read this, and then I have my list, which is going to get me till the second coming because it's super long. And then I wind up triaging. And sometimes people will send me books that I hadn't intended to read and go, wow, what a great book. I read history. I read history a lot. So for history of the period, people like Eric Gruen, Martin Goodman, really good people.
Well, AJ, you've really animated our imaginations and expanded them. And
Good.
That's really the goal of this conversational series and these gatherings. So I want to thank you for that. I want to thank you for your dedication to dialogue. Oftentimes we go into conversations, and conversations are sometimes risk-filled endeavors, but they're risk-filled with a particular promise that we may be changed by them. Thank you for visiting with us, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We do invite everyone to join us for a reception that will be right across Hearn Plaza in Le Louvre Lounge, right in Reynolda Hall. So we'll have a reception where we can continue the conversation. And I did make one promise that we would announce the theme for next year's series of conversations and dialogues for the Initiative on Religion, Pluralism, and American Public Life. With this year's theme, Across the Borders of Tradition, Conversations in Christian and Jewish Thought and Theology, next year we're moving to another theme. And this theme will be informed by our conversations and the work here that we've done this year. Next year's theme is Sacred, Secular, Solidarity, New Visions of the Common Good. We look forward to having you join us next year for our conversations, but let's continue the conversation at the reception. Thank you all, and good evening.